Welcome everyone to our first panel. What is Khurbn Yiddish? Featuring three speakers. As Hannah said, these are pre-recorded talks, so the speakers won't be rehearsing their talk except for brief thumbnails to kind of refresh memories. But the assumption is that we all watch these pre-recorded videos. And so the three speakers on this panel are Hannah Paulin-Galay, Malena Chinsky, and Perla Sneh. And I want to just reiterate what Hannah said. Please, I encourage audience members, both conference participants and members of the general public, to type your questions into the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as we can as time will allow. I'll say a few opening remarks about the panel, and then I'll ask the speakers to introduce themselves. We're not going to full bios, those also posted online, and then just to kind of give a brief sort of a statement of what this, but not rehearsing the argument. So I listened to and watched the papers on this panel with great interest, and I thank each of you on the panel for starting us off with such rich work to discuss. I feel this panel's papers go to the heart of this conference, which, if I were to try to sum it up as concisely as possible and to echo what Hannah said in her eloquent opening remarks, is to continue to build on the work of pioneers in the field of Yiddish-focused Holocaust studies and to insist with that work on attending to Yiddish as a language and idiom and a medium of creative thought and action throughout the years of annihilation and in the aftermath, and not merely, as to paraphrase Perla's presentation, an abstract with loss, silence, or unspeakability. The Glossris, Kaplan, Blumenthal, and Spivak, whom Hannah discusses, insisted on the crucial importance of documenting, hearing, sitting with, and transmitting lexicon of ghetto and camp life as a record of how Yiddish speakers creatively adapted radically novel realities into which they were thrown, including new moral realities in which, as David Beer insisted, a Shabrovnik was not simply a ganef. It required a new word, right? So not the subhuman stutter that Harshav heard, Yiddish, as Hannah helps us hear it, was not only just better, it certainly was, but also generative, creative, nuance, and cutting. It remained Yiddish speech, not silence or inarticulate cry. Nachman Blumenthal's devotion to recovering all possible manuscripts of Khurbn era writing similarly bespeaks an absolute commitment to attending to people's words. Each recovered manuscript rescued a human being's words from the oblivion and silence to which the murderers would have relegated them, and in so many cases did. And Blumenthal's commitment to reconstructing the all-important micro-contexts of works of Khurbn literature, a poem written in Chelmo, in the example that Malena Chinsky took us through, vehemently insist on these recovered pages as radically situated thought and speech, as defiantly creative events. Perla Sneh announced an exciting project of Buenos Aires YIVO, a new center for Khurbn Forschung that will be dedicated, among other things, to rescuing from silence Yiddish sources by bringing out Spanish translations of Yiddish cultural production during the war years. Quite poignant for me in Perla's presentation was her point that Golden Harvest, the well-known book by Jan Gross and Irina Grudzinska-Gross, in many ways rehearses a study in Yiddish published in 1952. This aptly attests to the extent to which not only primary sources, but also secondary work in Yiddish has remained in a blind spot of even major Holocaust historians. In other words, the extent to which Yiddish has not been thought of as a language of thought. So I think that's kind of, as a general introduction, and now I would ask each of you to introduce yourselves, each of you on the panel, to introduce yourself, brief 2 to 3 minute recap of your presentation. Let's go in the order that you're listed on the program. So first Hannah, and then Malena and Perla, if I can just use your first names, although I don't know Malena and Perla personally yet. But Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna cede to Perla
Up to
since I
you, Hannah.
just spoke, so that'll give me a minute to catch my breath from
Okay, great.
all my
Okay, great. Perla, I
yes.
have no preference.
Perla, please, if you'll do a quick recap,
Please,
and I'll do
Perla.
my recap, and then Milena, and then we can all start discussing. Okay, thank you.
Instead of presenting myself, I will like to say a few words about what I presented, but it's difficult to summarize such a complex issue in a few minutes. I will just state my position. For me, words are important, not only as a matter of precision, but because of their historical and symbolic weight. Linguistic options are never neutral. They were not then, they still are not. To say Khurbn, Holocaust, or Shoah is more than an elegant nuance in a linguistic quarrel. It is a political, even an existential statement. The absence of Yiddish has imposed some interpretative trends that must be critically questioned. The most obvious, although not the only one, is the one that pervaded for a long time the study of Jewish resistance. It is not by chance that Rochel Auerbach calls the discourse and manifestos of the Jewish fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto a Qual von Mut und Pathos, a source of courage and pathos. That pathos is Yiddish and must be a part of Khurbn narratives. Yiddish became tied to an ominous lack of distance with the horror of extermination, a horror that lingers. Maybe it is also tied to a kind of academic illusion, an illusion that Yiddish, with its very words actualizing a dreadful experience, seems to undermine the academic illusion of an abstract conceptualization of horror. And maybe that particular illusion is the commanding force behind the only official role usually given to Yiddish, a kind of a ritual artifact for remembrance, mostly in the forms of songs. A paradigmatic example is Hirschglick's Partisaner Lied with its dramatic opening words, Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. This ritual presence seems to be the only way to tolerate the agonizing sounds of a language that, with all its tenderness, its joyful ability for irony and curse, its domestic charming tone, had to pronounce the worst words in our darkest hour. The language in which we tell the story of the Hurman must be a language of resistance. If we listen to the words actually pronounced by the Jewish fighters, we see that saving lives was rarely a main objective, not because of a romantic or a sacrificial stand, but because the fighters knew they were doomed. Still, they did not lack equally powerful reasons to fight. One was their wish to pass on to future generations the very fact of their having taken arms against the murderer enemy. Another reason was put simply in one Yiddish word, nekome, vengeance. A word as frequent then as it is absent now. Nekome was uttered by believers and non-believers, educated and lay people, assimilated and pious, Zionists, Bundists, socialists, communists, reactionaries. Written in ink, lead, charcoal, or blood, it appears in inscriptions, graffiti, notizen, diaries, and letters. Are these really the last moments of our life? Nekome. For Jews experiencing the Khurbn as a wish
Perla,
or as a mission, yes,
Perla, thank
yes,
you. This is wonderful. I'm wondering if you could wrap it up because we have for discussion and we really want to keep these brief
okay,
introductions to 3 minutes max, and we're a little bit over that
okay.
now. Thank you.
Just for instance, Elias Spivak, mentioned by Hannah in her interesting work, uh, he has a whole chapter about the word nekome. Nekome was Blumenthal so aptly display his work by Malena, he also speaks about Nekome as a as a leading force for resistance. We have to make way to a new alternative consideration of Khurbn Yiddish in any way you translate it. That of a forgotten and powerful rhetoric that provides not only a discourse of memory, but a way of resistance and endurance. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll move on to or to Malena.
Up to you.
Which were you thinking?
That's
Okay,
nice.
okay, we'll go to Malena and then to okay, because I wanted to have a little moment. So okay, Malena, would you be able to go?
Hi. So it's my turn.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So just a refresher of the paper. I'll be brief. This conference about new approaches, and in this case, it's also about new archives, because Blumenthal's works, Blumenthal's archives are accessible, but since not long ago. And my interest in Blumenthal's works related precisely to the recovery of and transfer of Blumenthal's archives from an attic in Vancouver, Blumenthal's son, to the Igor in 2019, during the period when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the HESS in France and worked together with a group of female researchers who carried out this initiative. Since then, things have evolved, and today Blumenthal's papers have been classified and digitized and are fully accessible online. My presentation is based on Blumenthal's published writings. I began this research before the papers were online. Blumenthal's writings on Yiddish literature under the German occupation. And the theoretical dimension beyond the collecting itself is probably a specificity of Blumenthal's approach. So both the collecting and the theoretical approach. I try to convey both the value of the pieces collected by Blumenthal and Blumenthal's original perspectives in my paper. So first I presented some of Blumenthal's methodological remarks regarding the writings recovered after the war, which I referred to as ironic narrative. And this is followed by a presentation of a full poem found by Blumenthal in the ruins of the Chelmno jet camp in the first English translation by Alan Astrom. And I chose this particular text because it entered into dialogue with my colleague Katrin Stoll's research on the Polish judicial expedition to the site of Chelmno in May 1945, in which members of the Central Jewish Historical Commission participated, including Blumenthal, whom we can see in some of the pictures shared with me by Katrin. And this exchange has enabled us to contrast Blumenthal's writings produced for separate settings and contexts and with different aims, to the point of even having the impression that these are two separate researchers. The only source we have for the Chelmno poem is Blumenthal's published work. I haven't seen in the archives the original piece, but he mentions that the piece was falling apart already in the 60s. And we find it twice. The first time in an article published in Kiem in 1948, and almost 20 years later in the last volume of Das Politische Judentum, where we see also some advances in Blumenthal's deciphering of the manuscript. And still a lot of work needs to be done in the collection of Blumenthal's published pieces on Yiddish literature in Yiddish journals, and also the study of the archives. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will now move to Hannah.
Good. Thank you both so much, Malena and Perlet. So as you watched, my lecture explores the thousands of words and phrases that were added to the Yiddish language during the Holocaust, by some estimation 3,000, and this amassed into what linguists call a new sociolect, in which I called Khurbn Yiddish. And now, funnily enough, I thought I invented the term Khurbn Yiddish, or I did, and at the same time, Perlet did too. So that means that all great minds think alike. And my connection to Malena is that so much of my research is drawn from Nachman Blumenthal, and here she is working on him too, and his sense of irony. So I have these different connections with both of the papers. So I'm fascinated with these words. I'm fascinated by the way that researchers, both Holocaust survivors, Holocaust victims during the Holocaust and afterwards, uplifted and elevated these words as a form of testimony, as a statement of self. And that's a bizarre choice. Some of these words are quite lewd, disgusting, and embarrassing. And nonetheless, they thought that this was a new cultural treasure, or at least some deep form of truth in these words. And so my paper, it was called, as you saw, the destruction of Yiddish, meaning Khurbn Yiddish as the end of Yiddish, or destruction Yiddish with a dash, a new modality of looking at Yiddish and Yiddish culture, and not the end of the culture. And I focus on the life and times of one particularly strange word, shabrevin, and I do offer that this is more Khurbn Yiddish with a dash, destruction Yiddish than the destruction of Yiddish. So that's my summary. And now we can open it up to dialogue, however Eric wants to do this.
Thank you. So we have a protocol behind time, which is not so surprising. So I will pose a question, and I want to remind you to please put questions into the chat, and we will use them. And so the way that we're thinking of this, I will pose a question that each speaker can respond to. And if you don't feel like you have anything that is not a good question for you, don't feel obliged to do something. And we will ask the speakers to ask each other questions, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So that's how we'll go. So my question for each of you, and I hope that you can hear me. I apologize for my Wi-Fi. I trying to work with that, but that's what we're right now. So the projects that each of you are studying aimed at attending to Yiddish Jewish creativity during the very years of annihilation and or the immediate post-war years. And these projects succeeded in some ways and failed in others. For cultural and political reasons, the Jewish world, by and large, did not lend its ear fully to the Yiddish sources and voices that Blumenthal and other Yiddish historians and collectors wanted to see take up a far more central place in Holocaust memory and in the Jewish cultural legacy more generally. So my question is, how do you see your work as scholars today relating to the wartime and early post-war projects that you are studying? Do you feel like you're continuing that work? Has too much changed in the intervening decades to be able to speak in terms of continuation? Is that a problematic kind of way to frame it? In general, how do you see, or how would you understand your own undertakings vis-a-vis the cultural projects that you are studying? And if anyone wants to go,
shall we go in order? Perla, would you like to go first?
I can call. Please.
I don't. I'm not sure I understand the question, but for me, it's a very lonely undertaking because, especially in South America, which is a place for a very specific study for life of Yiddish and study of it, but there is not a wide field of Yiddish studies regarding the Holocaust, regarding the Khurbn. So we basically work pretty much alone. And that's, I think, a note, a characteristic note of this field in South America. I don't know if this answers your question, but that's what I have to say.
So maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic than Perla, moderate optimism. Well, my work on Blumenthal is pretty recent, but I can say that when I began my doctoral research like 15 years ago, and I was I was researching the commemoration of the Holocaust in Argentina. And I remember at the very beginning, I mean, going to a Holocaust institution and speaking with an activist. And this person was telling me that you're in the early post-war years, you're not going to find anything because nothing was being done those days. And behind this person, I was seeing Dos Polish Judentum, all the volumes that were published in Buenos Aires in that period. So this was also a very significant event. And I have to say that today, things have changed in a certain way. I think our work, even though we are few in numbers, our work has contributed to, I mean, the fact that now it's part of the landscape that people know about, I mean, Jews undertaking all kinds of cultural projects and commemoration those years, and Yiddish becoming I mean, without access to Yiddish, you would think maybe that nothing was being done, but once you discover this universe that you didn't know, then things change. I don't know if this answers our question.
Thank you very much.
I would like to add something. Malena is completely right. We had a very important work on the field, like the Polish Judentum and other undertakings. But now, today, in today's academic scene, this is not very, this is a matter that's not very present.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think that this is a question that I've dealt with a lot because I am a Khurbn Yiddish researcher, and part of my research is researching Khurbn Yiddish researchers. So what am I doing? Am I just translating their work into English for an international public? Am I changing something? Am I critical of them? Am I complimenting them? Am I supposed to have an emotional connection with them? Am I using their sources? Am I correcting them? These are questions that I've asked myself throughout. And I think that in my work, in my forthcoming book, Occupied Words, I think I try to strike different stances. That is, at some points, I am explaining what they did so that they can have exposure and that their work is recognized, that their journeys are recognized, that their forms of selfhood are recognized. And at other times, I'm going into their actual philological work and I'm investigating it alongside them, sometimes correcting them, often extending their work, limbing it, interpreting their interpretations. And one thing that really helps in the extension of their philological work is technology. As much as a technophobe I am known to be, the fact that the Yiddish Book Center has scanned over 10,000 Yiddish books, many of which are related to the Holocaust, and that I can do a word search and see if their if Blumenthal, Kaplan, Spivak's references or definitions or examples of these neologisms are ring true on a larger scale, if they scale out, is huge. So I made generous use of present day technology, of word searches to search beyond what they did. And yeah, they were onto something. There was never a case where they said, look at this word, and I didn't find it again and again and again and again and again, you know, using the quantitative search methods. So that was really exciting for me. So I think that I do some dancing with them. I'm continuing their work, but I'm changing it. I'm adding some of my own. And sometimes I'm personal and I'm admiring them. Sometimes I'm critical and sometimes I'm interpretive. I see we have some questions. Okay.
Yes, we do. So if I could ask Dominic, you have a question. If you could unmute yourself and pose that question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to all of you for really fantastic talks and introducing them and summarizing them now. really great way to kick things off and to start thinking about the issues we're dealing with in this conference. I noticed in your talks that in a number of cases you were talking in essentially what you might call aesthetic terms. So Hannah, you're talking about the kind of the taste or the feel that language or Khurbn Yiddish has, and Milena, you were talking specifically about this sort of transformation of aesthetics, saying that if a poem is written in Khurbn Treblinka, it's automatically a masterpiece. I'm just wondering if there's anything more that you could say about this question of aesthetics, because obviously kind of traditionally, right, I mean, if we were thinking in terms of what often gets called Adorno is often misunderstood, but I actually think it's more complicated even than that. Statement about art in Auschwitz, or if you think about that seminar that Claude Lanzmann did, was it at Yale? But it was published in Yale French Studies, where somebody says and uses the word aesthetic, and he says, "You say aesthetic, how dare you use that word?" But it seems that in the terms that you're talking about, it's actually a valuable word, perhaps term, but certainly kind of mode of thinking that seems important. I just wonder if you have any other thoughts about that.
Great. I can start while the others are thinking. So the aesthetic question is important to them, not just to the researchers, and also to the people who are living and feeling these words at the time. I mean, this is what I share in my paper, that Shabrlevin, this word, that part of what Opochinski, I mean, let's just pause for a second and think about this. He's just lost everything. He's lost his entire community, and he's sitting down and writing about how this word sounds. So if they're interested in aesthetics, I think we can be and should be interested in aesthetics too. The aesthetics that they're arguing with, they're arguing for a new type of aesthetics, and to appreciate the aesthetics, the poetic kernel in these bizarre syllables. And some people did not appreciate these aesthetics. Thus, the poet Hey Leivik, when he visited the DP camps and he discussed the term katsetnik, famous word, katsetler, he said it lacks euphony. And he said, this is fine, it's truthful, it's respectful towards the experience, but it's not aesthetic. And then you have Chava Rosenfarb and others come back and say, hey, wait a minute, this is poetry, or it can be poetry. And I think that the argument about aesthetics is exactly the question of Khurbn Yiddish as the destruction of Yiddish, or destruction Yiddish with a dash. Is this the destruction of aesthetics, or is this creation of a new aesthetics? And I think it's worth looking into how this can be framed as beautiful, not just right and true and reflective, but as poetic and beautiful.
So
We have.
Sorry, may I add?
Please go ahead. Absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to add that in the case of Blumenthal, these remarks about how, I mean, Sobibor and Treblinka are literary criteria. This is what Blumenthal insists on, this idea in his writings. And I think this is a point that where aesthetics actually is leading to ethics, and the idea that these are great masterpieces is because of the spiritual dimension these pieces convey. The very fact that they were found in a site like Chelno or Treblinka make these pieces a masterpiece, but not according to aesthetic or literary criteria that are coming from a different period, but because these works are revealing a human dimension, according to Blumenthal. It's the very fact that a human being was able to respond in such a way, in such extreme conditions, is revealing us something about humanity that only real art can do, as only real art pieces can do. This is Blumenthal's take.
May I add something?
Please, Carla.
Continuing with what Malena said, this is a question that was taken into consideration since a long time ago. I can refer you to Shmuel Rozhansky's foreword in the volume Khurbn in the Musterwerk of the Yiddish Literatur. He says there that the first casualty of the Nazis was Yiddish literature, referring to Khurbn literature. So this is a question, this is not a new question. This is something that has been an interest of everyone since the Khurbn. That's it.
Great. So we have a number of questions, and I think what we're going to do with an eye on time, I think if we go one by one, we may not get to all of them. So I'm going to pool questions and ask you to kind of, the speakers, take a note and refer to which among them that you feel strongest, and if we may have time for you to get to all of them, but I want all the questions to be posed. So I'm going to ask 3 people to pose questions, and then open it up back to.
Can we also have the opportunity to ask questions to our co-panelists among ourselves?
Yes, after, so I was thinking to conclude with that,
Okay.
if that makes sense. Okay, so we'll have this last round of questions from the audience, and then you'll have the time to ask each other questions. So we have David, we have Sonia and Katrin. And if David, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, and then Sonia, and then Katrin. Thank you.
So the question is about Khurbn Yiddish, whether it's a measure of continuity or radical break. So Hannah Poland has this wonderful concluding sentence: is neologism a corruption or is it poetry? And is Nekoma, the call for Nekoma, something unprecedented, a radical break with the past, or is this a measure of some kind of Jewish continuity? So that's and the question that follows from that, which is also historical, chronological, will it be possible to construct a chronology of this language? So the language of the ghettos precedes that of the camps. Is that a productive way to proceed, to try to see these things, the before and the after, where language still exists within a communal or pseudo-communal structure, and then you're thrown into a concentrationary universe with a whole other language? So both questions have to do with the power of what we can do in Yiddish that we can't do in other languages, which is to look at the chronology.
Great. So the question of chronology, and Sonia, if you could pose your question.
So David's question was about what we can do with Yiddish that we can't do in other languages. But my question was, to what extent are these changes that happen to Yiddish, other than the obvious destruction, possibly in conversation or parallel with other languages? I mean, thinking in particular about Victor Klemper's documentation about how the German language changed during the Third Reich. And I was curious about things like language contact or use of certain sorts of, I guess, Nazi euphemism, and how they might have come into the Yiddish language. Thank you.
Great. And also, Katrin, you had a question, and if you could unmute yourself and ask that. I'll go ahead and read. Oh, go ahead. Are you there? Great. Thank you, please.
No, that was me suggesting that you read it out loud, so.
Okay, we're on the same page. I'll read it for us. So,
right,
let's
all just agree that we're gonna laugh if we have technical glitches.
Sorry,
Right? That'll make my life a lot easier. I've spent the last 8 months trying to avoid technical glitches, but a Mensch tracht und Gott lacht, so God lacht with him too, okay?
Okay,
All right,
thank you.
so,
I'm going to read it out. Thank you. Speaking for myself, thank you. What can we say about the Polish context and the representation of the place of Poles and Polish culture in the Yiddish writings? And as we discussed with Malena, this aspect is important in Blumenthal's Polish-speaking writings and material pertaining to the sites of the former Nazi extermination camps and the surroundings, and his visits to the sites. And of course, I mean, thinking of Chelmno, one aspect is the Catholic Church, which is vis-a-vis the palace and the place where the Germans murdered Jews in the first phase of the extermination camp. And Blumenthal went there in 1945 to note down inscriptions written down in the walls of the church, left by Jews who were murdered the next day. So they were kept there, and temporarily, as it was used, the Catholic Church was used by the Germans as a temporary prison. And he noted down these inscriptions. And when Landsmann came in 1979 with his crew, he also saw some of these inscriptions. I have a paper on this. It's currently in peer review. I just wanted to say, we discussed it with Malena as well. I mean, there was also this Polish dictionary that Blumenthal composed. So maybe it relates a little bit to the last question. What can we say about language contact, but also maybe cultural contact? Yes, so I mean the representation of Poles in the writings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm gonna.
Okay.
Sorry. I just unmuted the mute.
Remember,
there are more questions.
Laugh, everybody. Okay.
Exactly. So we're going to
stay on message. Laughter. Okay.
Okay. So we're going to leave it. There's some more questions I hope to be able to get to, but let's let the panelists respond to those and then ask each other questions, and then we'll come back if we have time to other questions. Go ahead. Would anyone like to actually? I guess the question is more for Hannah from David about chronology, and if you have thoughts on that.
Yes, great, and I'll be brief so that my panelists join in, of course. Yeah, I think that well, you know, when we study a testimony, like a story, a narrative, that has a certain chronology to it. That can skip over years at a time or months at a time. And I think that studying words gives us a different chronology because it shows something that is cumulative. We don't know exactly the moment when a word's been formed, but we see cumulative day-to-day experiences built up into that word. And so chronology looks different. And I think that, yeah, the question of that's what they dealt with. This is a total break in the Yiddish language. Let's somehow make it a new chapter in the way we look at it. To the questions of language contact, and that was both Katrine and and Sonia's questions. I do address these at different points in my book, so I'll be brief and let you read that. I have a whole chapter on contact with German and a significant portion of the contact with Polish, which I was able to do much thanks to my friend Katarzyna Persson, who's here, and my graduate student Jovita Pancik, who is here too. So thank you to them for that help with the Polish. So I'll start with the contact. Part of what's new about Khurbn Yiddish is that they have new experiences that have never been described before, and you have to have new words to describe new experiences and new phenomena. Another thing that's new is that languages are interacting in a totally new way. German and Yiddish have always interacted. They come from the same, they have similar roots, but they're interacting in an intensely different way in modern times that's unprecedented and has a very, very stark power dynamic. Polish and Yiddish always interacted, but here people are crammed literally into the same apartment together. Urban Polish speakers and shtetlich Yiddish speakers are now living in close contact, and there's actually a satiric play about those language interactions, and you can look at how those interactions work in a new way. Mute, please.
If you could please mute yourself, that would be helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
So there are those interactions, and yes, Victor Klemperer commented on how German is changing, and Polish speakers also commented on how Polish is becoming Yiddishized and Polish is changing. So someone could take this same study and do it with the other languages. I did it with Yiddish, and the floor is yours to others who want to take it in other directions. But I give specific examples in my research of words that come from both of these other wartime languages, but mean something different when they enter Yiddish. Like organisieren, to organize, which means to steal in all three of the languages mentioned, but it means to steal and something else in Yiddish. So I think the specificity is there as well as the connections.
Thank you,
Perle, Malena, yes.
Thank you. Perle or Malena want to
Thank
either
you.
answer the questions, or if you want to pose a question, that's a possibility.
Answer and comment on the questions. Well, I haven't read Hannah's book, so but I was also thinking about this idea of Khurbn Yiddish and the specificity of Yiddish. Katherine's asking about the Polish context and the Polish cultural content of these words. And so I wanted to comment that it's not I don't work on the lexicons and this wartime jargon, but Blumenthal's title is Wörter und Wörtlich von der Khurbn Tkufe. It doesn't use the word Yiddish in the title. And in the introduction, when we read the introduction to the book, what he's saying is that actually Yiddish is not a decisive criterion, because precisely Jews spoke many different languages and even tried to avoid Yiddish when possible. And then he says that a large amount of words, when after being stripped of their Yiddish garb, turn out to be foreign words. And so the Polish is really, is everywhere. The first page of Wörter und Wörtlich is the word, or the derivative of the word oboz, obóz, oboznik, and all. So you go into the Polish context right away in these dictionaries. So I'm wondering, to what extent this expression Khurbn Yiddish is in a certain way, taking us a little farther away from the historical context, whereas the word Tkufe that it's in Blumenthal's title is more like we are anchoring in the context where these words were coined and used and made sense to their speakers.
Just to note that his other essays that he wrote about the language do have Yiddish in the title. So I know you're really familiar with his archive. So he has a lot of different essays where he says this is about Yiddish. So I'm not sure that he decided completely. And of course, he's not the only one writing about the language. There's also Yisrael Kaplan, and there's Spivak and others, and each of them has a different position vis-a-vis how Yiddish is this versus how much of this is Lagersprache or a patois. So there's a kind of sliding scale there, both within Blumenthal's work and among the different, I think, researchers who looked at this.
May I add something?
Please.
For me, it's very interesting how Blumenthal, Kaplan, and Spivak, they have a view that many years later, Roland Barthes translated as what is fascism in a language. Fascism is not what the language doesn't say, but that what the language has to say. And they look in Yiddish, they find in Yiddish that violence made to Yiddish language by Nazism, the Yiddish had to come up with new words that weren't part of the Yiddish culture because of Nazism. And that, for me, it's very interesting in the work of all these also answering to a work or to a question. For me, they were activists. They were activists, and there is a special activism in taking Yiddish into consideration in these studies. And one more thing regarding aesthetical questions. Ruchel Auerbach went in 1947, went with other researchers. They went to Treblinka, and there they were there, and one of them found a little foot, the foot of a child, with still some flesh adhered to it. And he took it and he wrapped it and he put it in his pocket close to his heart. Everybody was horrorized with that. And he said, that could be the foot of my child who came with me to Treblinka. And then Ruchel Auerbach says, we know that any schmaltz words are completely out of place here. But what could we say, and this only by chance, this could be the real truth, the plain truth. So this is something that has to be taken into consideration to any aesthetical judgment of the Yiddish poetry and Yiddish creativity in all.
Thank you. Are there, Hannah, or I think Melanie, you asked your question. Was that the question that you wanted to ask, or did you have other questions? And if Hannah or Perla have questions for your colleagues on the panel, now would be the time to put them out.
Yeah. Great. I would like to ask Melina about what you think the significance of irony is in Blumenthal's framework. What's the ethics behind that? Why is irony important? And I wanted to ask Perla that I wanted you in your lecture, you have this wonderful moment where you analyze the famous photo of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto holding up his hands, and you zoom in on these different parts of the photograph, and you show this young girl on the side in the background that's sticking her tongue out. And you said that the girl sticking her tongue out, the tongue is Yiddish. And so I wanted you to tell us more, if you could, about what you thought that is. Is it Yiddish because it's humor? Is it Yiddish because it's defiance? Is it Yiddish because it's in the background? And it's what is that about? So those are my questions.
Oh, I may ask one question.
Yes, yeah.
Co-panelists, and then I'll try to answer Hannah's question. So yeah, it's again about Khurbn Yiddish, and so to what extent has Yiddish been transformed for good in the Holocaust? What do you think? Because I mean, this jargon, as sorry to call it this way, I'm not making a statement out of it, but okay. Blumenthal says that the beginning of the dictionary is because when he came into contact with survivors after 3 years not being in Poland, he just didn't understand what people said. In order to understand their testimonies, he needed to, make notes for himself, and that was the origin of the dictionary. In the glossary included by Kaczerginski in the end of the volume is also, Khurbn Vilne. I think the intention is to give tools for the reader to understand many of the terms that are being used in the book in order to explain the period. So I'm a bit obsessed about the idea of kufe, the fact that these words make sense and help to explain the period. And also, in order to understand the period, we need to understand these words. This is Blumenthal's take. So what happens after, once these words are not being used anymore, and how has the language been, because there's literary creation after the Holocaust, how is the language being transformed for good, if so? And that's my question.
Perla, do you want to ask something?
Well, I don't know. I don't have a question, but
We only have 1 minute left. Maybe you want to just answer something?
okay. I think Yiddish, what you said, Hannah, that tongue is Yiddish because of everything, because of the humor, because of defiance, and because you have to search for it in the, it's not in the main center of the gaze of everybody. You have to search for it and take it to the first row. And about what happened to Yiddish, I was remembering Sutzkever tells us in his memoirs that once he went away from the Vilna ghetto, he was hiding in a place outside the ghetto for a few months. And then he had to come back to the ghetto because someone was about to denounce him. He went back to the ghetto, and he said when he came back to the ghetto after a few months, he couldn't understand what people were saying. His own language, the language of the ghetto that he knew, was already changed. And he was a part of that language, and for him it was strange. So I have no doubt that we have to take this into consideration to understand what was happening there. And one more thing, words regarding what happened to that Yiddish, for instance, organisieren is a word that went into the Jewish culture in Israel, in the Tzava, you know, להתארגן זה לקבל to find something with not completely legal terms. And I think also organizing is not simply theft.
No, definitely not.
It's something else. Yeah. And I mean, this is an ethical question.
Yeah. Yes, Khurbn, it haunts other languages. It haunts Hebrew, Khurbn Yiddish, it haunts Polish. And it, I think that people, Yiddish speakers themselves were embarrassed by Khurbn Yiddish, and they wanted to take it out of the lexicon, move on. I mean, Sutzkever, whom we've cited several times, he started out with Khurbn Yiddish, and then he erased it. He wanted to elevate his work aesthetically and to make it clean, modernist, dignified. He didn't want that memory there. And the people who did want that memory there, I think, were drowned out, and they were discriminated against in the workplace, I think, for this, and their projects were sidelined. So we are changing things a bit up here by paying attention to their work and bringing this back in. So I owe everyone a break. So we have a 15-minute break here. So Eric, do you want to just wrap up?
Yes, yeah, please, I'd be happy to. I want to just I want to read 2 questions that we will not be able to answer, but I want them to be posed so that people can think about them. So one is from Anna Sternschis, and she says, I'm curious on what presenters think about the relationship between scholarship and activism politics in all their case studies. So much of early Holocaust scholarship was either dismissed because it was done by survivors, thus it was activism, it wasn't objective historiography, right? Or survivors themselves focused on other aspects of World War II in their scholarship, such as Gerhard Weinberg writing about the persecution of the mentally ill rather than of Jews. In the Yiddish case, was much of this collecting work a form of activism that can only be studied now because so long it was simply considered illegitimate or dismissed as activism rather than scholarship. And Avi Noam, Pat builds on that and says, just a comment to follow up on Anna's excellent point. It is remarkable that in the immediate aftermath of the war, so many of these vital questions were asked by quote unquote survivor historians. And we're only now returning to them. And Mark Smith's work, of course, on those is important. For example, Israel Kaplan, I'm back to Avi Noam's question. I will talk about this on Wednesday, initiated a project in post-war Germany to study the Jewish use of language during the war. This hasn't really been picked up for 80 years until now. Our study of Jewish responses and a truly integrated history of the Shoah is really in its infancy. So I'll just leave you with those questions that we won't have time, but perhaps in the interstices of the conference, you can talk to people about them. I want you to know that they had those questions. There's one other question about the verb organizieren in Polish coming from Roman Musialik Anderl. It says it has more than one meaning than to steal, including to steal as in Yiddish. So that's something also to think about. I thank you so much for rich papers, for a rich discussion, and we do need a break.
Yes, thanks
you all.
everyone. So we have a 15-minute break now, and then you can sign back on through or keep on this link. The general audience's link is now room is now working. So you can join that or you can stay here, but just if you're a general audience or anybody, please remember that mute button unless you're speaking. Thanks for everyone's patience and goodwill and good spirit, and hartlichen Dank for my two panelists, Perla and Malena. It was an honor to be with you, and for Eric for chairing. See you at 5. We have 10 minutes, 5:30. Bye.